Hi, I'm Max Brooks, and on this episode of Max Brooks Breaks Down, I try to tackle a question that Americans always ask about things happening outside of America. Why should I care? And it's a legitimate question. We're not just being callous and cruel, not all of us. But we are an isolationist people, and we have more than our own problems to deal with. And as long as what's happening over there doesn't affect us over here, why not let the rest of the world solve their own problems? But the problem with that is those problems don't always stay over there. History has shown us that eventually we are going to have to deal with them. From Pearl Harbor to 9/11 to COVID, we need to pay attention to what's happening over there and why it affects us. And this is particularly important right now with what is happening in Ukraine. I don't know.
I am here with Evelyn Farkas. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. She has had over 30 years foreign policy experience, and she is here to answer the big question. Now, Evelyn, I don't know if you've ever seen the old 1980s movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, but when he's taking his oral exam for college, his professor says to him, I just have one question for you in 27 pots. And that's similar
Right.
to what we're trying to break down. So I'm going to start with the big question and we'll break it down. We're going to ask, what does a Putin victory mean? And we'll start with, what does a Vladimir Putin victory in Ukraine mean for Ukraine?
Well, Max, so first of all, thanks so much for having me on. It's been a while since I saw you, so this is a lot of fun. A Vladimir Putin victory for Ukraine means a loss of their sovereignty. He wants to install a puppet government, a government that will do what he says. But I believe in this instance, he'll probably try to absorb it into the Russian Federation. He'll try not to have Ukraine as an independent state, but maybe he will allow it to remain because it is a member, of course, of the United Nations and is a sovereign state. But just as he's tried to do with Belarus, he will take away every shred of sovereignty that he can. Because remember, what he's trying to do here, Max, is recreate this Russian empire, not even a Soviet empire. He has this like revanchist idea of, Russia in the past and this Russian empire, very nostalgic and also very wrong-headed. And it's aimed at righting some wrongs that he feels were done to the Soviet Union and to Russia. And so he's trying to cement his place in history by achieving this outcome, which he's not going to achieve, of course.
So that's the very local picture. That's what it would mean for Ukraine. Now, what would this victory for Putin also mean for the rest of Europe?
It would be horrible because the way Vladimir Putin operates, once he gets his way somewhere, he'll keep going. He's not going to stop and say, okay, I'm happy with Ukraine. Because remember, Georgia, it's an independent country, although 20% of its territory is occupied by Russian forces, but it's still independent and democratic. Moldova, another small country neighboring Ukraine, is independent and democratic. Those two countries will undoubtedly get swallowed by Russia. They'll just move their forces in. They are not as large and as strong militarily and otherwise as Ukraine, so they will succumb. If we've let Ukraine fall already in your scenario, we won't be able to do very much about Moldova and Georgia. And then, of course, after that, Putin will turn to NATO, and he will try to do something to test NATO's will. And if he attacks a NATO ally in some way, shape, or form, either using, little green men, so special operations forces, or using cyber or an actual conventional attack, and we do not respond firmly, decisively, and as a whole alliance under Article 5, as is required, collective defense, then he will break NATO and he will try to undermine democracy all over Europe.
So now what does a Putin victory mean for the rest of the world? Not just Europe, not just Ukraine, but everywhere. What message does that send to the rest of the world, and what course does it put us on?
Well, it puts us on a course where autocrats feel emboldened. Everyone who backed Putin, from Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's, it's a NATO ally and an EU member, but he's now being very quiet and not saying anything nice about Putin, although he's still trying to hedge his bets, all the way to, leaders like President Xi in China are being much more cautious because Putin looks like he's made a big mistake here. He's made a military blunder. And so for the autocrats, if Putin were to prevail, it would be a gift to them. They would feel like they were ascendant again, including in the United States. We would have those people who have been apologists, even now, for this disgusting, again, human rights infringing, almost genocidal war against Ukraine. Those people in America exist to this day. They're in Congress. And many of them would feel emboldened. And it would be then a danger to American democracy and a danger to democracy around the world. And make no mistake, he didn't stop in 2016. As we all know, of course, that he meddled in our elections, but he's continued through his agencies, through his activities of his secret services, et cetera, to propagate all kinds of disinformation in American society. And he will continue to do what he can to make America weak. President Biden was very right when he first came into office, and he said, we're in a standoff, autocracy against democracy. And this Putin's victory would only strengthen autocracy. The other thing is, for those who are, let's say they consider themselves neutral, it's a challenge to the entire international order that we set up after World War II. We said at the end of World War II, we don't want any more global war. We want sovereignty and borders to count, to matter, so you can't violate them using military force. We established the Geneva Conventions so that we wouldn't have wholesale genocide like we saw of the Jews. We said never again, and we codified it. And the Russians have violated all of these, not just norms, but the laws, the conventions that they signed. And we, the international community, if we let that pass, and we have already let a lot pass, then the international order will crumble. And then we will be in a much more dangerous world where it's, big countries basically forcing their will on small countries, dog eat dog, competitive environment economically and politically. And by the way, that will happen while our earth is on fire and melting literally at the same time, because this climate change is going to cause refugee flows and conflicts over resources like we've never seen before.
Are you comparing this to, I guess, Haile Selassie in 1936 when he went to the League of Nations and said, if Mussolini's invaded my country, if you don't stop him now, you're next? Didn't he say that today is us, tomorrow is you?
Yes, I think that's a very apt comparison. And in fact, in the first days of the war, there were citizens of Ukraine saying, I think it was in Kharkiv, one of the countries that came under, one of the cities that came under attack first, saying, this is not about Ukraine. You are being attacked also, and you will be next. And it's absolutely true.
So it sounds like the Ukrainians are fighting for all of us, and no one's forcing them to do it. No one is pushing them to fight. This is their fight. They chose it. They want it. And short of us actually getting involved and firing on the Russians and possibly triggering a nuclear World War III, what can we do to help them in their fight?
Okay, so what should we do? We have trained and equipped the Ukrainians for 8 years. We can see the results of that because what they're doing is they're being very flexible and resilient, and in small groups. They're coordinating, they're communicating, they're taking out Russians bit by bit using kind of real more classic insurgency tools, resistance tools. And I think if we continue to provide that kind of training to more Ukrainians, because obviously Ukrainians are dying and we need to train up new forces, and there are new territorial defenses being established every day. These are the regular Ukrainian people who are volunteering to help defend their country. We need to continue doing that training, but most importantly, we need to continue the pipeline of equipment so that the Ukrainians do not run out of the key ammunition like the javelins and the Stingers. The Stingers, though, don't get high enough to hit the bombers. And so that's where the S-300s come into play that our Secretary of Defense has been negotiating to get turned over to the Ukrainians from NATO allies. We need more of that because, again, it's the artillery, the cruise missiles, the bombing that is killing innocent civilians in hospitals, in orphanages, in their homes. And the other thing I would add to that, Max, and again, I want creativity. Don't tell the world what we're not going to do. Let's be creative. Close the sky any way you want to. I mean, as long as it doesn't, as you said, bring us into direct conflict with Russia, be creative. Think about how to do it. And frankly, it should be a global effort. There are 141 countries in the United Nations and the General Assembly who condemned what Russia is doing in Ukraine today. All 141 of those countries should be asked to contribute in arms and in economic pressure on Russia. Japan, South Korea, many other allies are heavily involved now in sanctioning Russia to make sure that they don't have access to cutting edge technology that they will need to replace those horrendous hypersonic missiles and other missiles that they have in their inventory that they're using against the Ukrainian people.
Well, that's a big picture way of looking at this conflict, I guess, because what you're saying is that if the Ukrainians are indeed fighting for the democratic rights of the entire world, then they shouldn't just be backed by America. They shouldn't just be backed by NATO. The entire world has a dog in this fight, and the entire world should be stepping up to help the Ukrainians fight their fight. It's a viewpoint, I think, is very contrary to some of, I don't know if you want to call them apologists or appeasers, but, we hear this argument that you don't want to provoke him, right? You don't want to get him angry because then he might roll in the tanks. But if I understand from what you're saying is Putin only respects strength and pushback. And so what you seem to be saying is the more you give him, the more he will want.
Right. And this is the thing with these labels. So Putin is the provocateur. He's the one who provoked this war by starting it. It was a war of choice. Of course, he started one already in 2014, but he renewed his offensive against Ukraine in a massive fashion this time with egregious human rights violations on an order that we really haven't seen since the Second World War, or at least since Syria. And so he is the one who is provoking the international community, provoking all of us.
Evelyn, thank you for putting this very regional conflict in a very global perspective and hopefully answering the big question, why should we care?
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe. And remember, we're all trapped together on this tiny little crowded planet. And unlike Vegas, what happens over there doesn't stay over there. Thank you.